And welcome to Moral Injury in People of Service. My name is Eva Savage, and I will be moderating this event on behalf of the Center for Post-Traumatic Growth. Before we start, we have a couple of housekeeping items. We will continue through this event without a break. However, you're welcome to take breaks as needed. The event is recorded, and it will be posted on our webpage tomorrow after 3 p.m., so you will not miss anything. As the content of the documentary includes graphic images that may be disturbing, we do have 2 mental health professionals in the audience who are available for support as needed. Laura and Michael, if you could identify yourself, please. And for our viewers online, please visit our webpage for referrals. We will be very happy to help you navigate the system as needed. And lastly, the event is both live streamed and recorded. However, no members of the audience, unless you identify yourself intentionally, will be seen. We do have a question period, last 30 minutes of the event. We have collected many questions and we have them organized to best suit our speakers. However, we will open the floor to the audience, and we will make sure that our viewers online have access to email their questions. And now, for the first part of the event, the opening remarks, I would like to welcome Jason Armstrong, Director, Visitor Experience, Canada Science and Technology Museum.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you here to the Canada Science and Technology Museum. My name is Jason Armstrong. As I said, I'm lucky and honored to be the Director of Visitor Experience here at the museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here for this topic today, both in person and for everyone who's joining us online. The museum has always been a space for curiosity, discovery, and dialogue. Qualities that I think are going to be essential as we navigate complex and pressing issues like the one we'll be exploring and discussing today. This afternoon's event provides us with an opportunity to delve into the challenges faced by people of service, explore the impact of moral injury, and how we as a community can better support those who have given so much of themselves. I'm not going to spend a lot of time up here. We have a lot of other things to do. But again, thank you for your commitment to this critical issue. And with that, I'll turn it back to Ava, who's going to introduce our keynote speaker.
If you can hear me. I will do the rest of the moderating from my seat over here. I would like to welcome retired Assistant Commissioner, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, Chis Parsons. In some 36 years as a police officer, he has worked throughout Canada and abroad in the Middle and Far East, Africa, and Europe. He has seen and lived through many challenging and life-altering experiences in his roles in the emergency response teams, national security, covert operations, serious organized crime, and major crime investigation. His advocacy led him to assume the role of mental health champion for RCMP for the final years of his career. Welcome, Assistant Commissioner Parsons.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and it's a wonderful opportunity to speak to you all today on this very, very important subject. As per my bio, I spent 36 years in service to the Crown. I did, over the course of my service, I ran into many difficult situations. I started my career in Fort McMurray, Alberta in the mid-'80s. Now, I should preface this, I'm an accountant by trade. Okay, so not exactly a very high-strung individual to begin with, and I was parachuted into Fort McMurray from Depot Division in Regina, and there basically the whole paradigm of my life changed. If there's change is a very gentle word for what happened. So it was only shortly after I arrived at McMurray, you get a trainer. Now again, these are jargon terms in the RCMP. They're many, many decades old. But you get a trainer assigned to a very nice young fellow, and he was guiding me through my recruit training, field training process. And as I was going through McMurray, of course, you're dealing with some extreme incidents. And within 2 or 3 months, I was involved in a high-stress, kinetic, physical encounter where I was actually cut by a knife. It was quite a fight. We referred to it in those days as a tilt. I nearly lost my life in that one. And there's a point to that. I began, after that altercation, to have certain thoughts, and my personality changed from a quiet, bookish individual to a more aggressive person. And that was reflected, of course, in my work, and my colleagues around me noticed that. It was basically the onset of post-traumatic stress disorder in connection with a horror and violence-based episode. Shortly after that, because I wasn't the only one living through this, my trainer took his life. Okay, so I had 5 months service. Already been through a fair bit of violence, and that was fine. I was equipped for it. It was no big deal, but it was leaving its mark. And then when Jerry took his life, I remember the sergeant came to me and said, look, you were his friend. I'll never forget these words. You were his friend. You have to go over to the trailer now. You have to get all this stuff together and get the hell out of there. In those days, we brought our guns home. We just hung them on the coat rack. These were revolvers as well, which are a foreign instrument to many of you, but 6-shooters. And I remember going in there, the body had been removed, but I still had to go through the house room by room by room and deal with all of the kit and things of that nature. And I remember coming back, I was very upset because prior to his suicide, I knew he was struggling, and I'd gone to the supervisor and said, look, is there something you can do for Jerry? Can you give him a break? Things are not working out. I'm rolling up on him in a police car. He's crying because in those days, you went to zones, you stayed in your zone. And I was trying to get him some help, but there was no help available in those days, of course. So after having to clean out his house and having to look at where he did take his life in the bathroom, I came back and I said, look, I'm not completely good with this. And I was told in a very forceful fashion, you got to keep your mouth shut because the commanding officer doesn't believe in suicide. My response at the time was, well, I just came from Jerry's house. There's a hole in the wall where his head used to be. It's pretty real to me, quote unquote, all right? The point here I'm trying to make is that there was a bifurcation in the trauma, okay? The violence and horror-based stuff, I just kept living that. I spent 15 years in limited duration postings in northern Canada. Listen, I've been shot at many times. I've seen friends shot in front of me. I've got a fragment of a bullet it's not in me anymore, but it did lodge in my back. It was just things like that were going on. That's a different kind of trauma than the moral injuries that came from the things that surrounded my friend's suicide. And by the way, the sergeant who told me to go to the house, very nice fellow, he took his life 2 years later. So by the time I had 3 years service, I'd lost good friends to suicide, and I was working for an organization that, quite frankly, didn't seem to care. And it was very, very difficult on me. Also, when you're going through these very serious kinetic events, there's always a culture of blame. I think it's referred to as accountability, you know. This culture of blame existed within the RCMP, and someone was always held responsible. And I mean, I remember the time where I got clipped, because I don't like to use the word wounded, but when I did get clipped, there seemed to be more concern about the damage to the police truck than there was concern about the damage to me. And in fact, I was told, you better go back to that crime scene the day after and you make sure that you help Aiden unpack your own attempted murder. These are not good things. So the two streams, the horror and violence-based trauma, plenty of it. Some of the stuff I saw overseas, because I'm permanently bound to secrecy, I can't talk about it, but it just piles on. The moral injuries, however, are a little bit different, but when they do tack themselves to a kinetic trauma, it's a completely different set of alchemy, all right? And my time is limited here tonight, so I will get through this. I tried for many, many years to get treatment for PTSD. It impacted my life, it impacted my family. I think I had about 30 years services around about 2018, 2017, when I was able to get some therapy for the kinetic stuff. And that came in the form of EMDR, and it really, really worked for me. For those of you that know what that is, that's fine. I don't have time to explain it, but it took away the nightmares. It took away the intrusive memories during the day. It took away all that stuff, all right? And I thought it was great. And the therapist that put me through this was absolutely gifted, but she also introduced me to pharmacology shortly thereafter, and I was given pills. Up until that time, I'd never taken any pills, all right? But through her, I got exposure to very strong sleeping medications, antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications, and all of these things serve to change your personality. So the EMDR3 took away the night terrors, and if my wife was here, night after night, I'd wake up screaming, night after night. Okay, and that was for years. EMDR took that away. I was very happy about it, but then I went down the road of pharmacology. And the problem with that was with the moral injuries that were attached to the blame game that was played every time there was a shooting or there was this or there was that. I began to develop a special kind of anger inside, and it was corrosive. It never went away. I describe PTSD trauma as a hard punch. When you get a flashback, bang, it just drops you to your knees, you're sweating, the adrenaline is flying. Moral injury, however, when it's attached to these sorts of things, is like a dull ache. It's a corrosive. It works its very insidious magic over time, and it whittles you down, and the older you get, the worse it gets, all right? So having gone through all this, EMDR, great stuff, now on to the pills. The pills completely changed me. My thought processes, my emotions, everything, trying to deal with things like a very, very different human being altogether. And I still knew that I was sick. I went to another therapist for inpatient therapy, actually, and this lady's quite gifted. She introduced me to this journaling business. And while I was there, I had to write it all down, some 30-odd pages written in manuscript, and we unpacked it together. And I looked at her and I said, this is going to take you a week. It took her 2 days maximum. In fact, by the end of day one, I was beginning to wonder what I was actually doing there. That's how good she was. I unpacked it, and then I presented it in tears in front of my colleagues. It was very difficult to do. And after that, I think the healing process started. But here's the special piece to this journaling, and I don't know the magic behind it, but it really works. I came into this lady's care addicted to pills. We have very slang terms for it: pilled out, rubberized, meat with eyes, you name it, it's all out there. But that's how it was. I remember she said to me, she said, bring me your medication. And it's emotional for me even to talk about it. And she was an older lady, but 60 years old. She took the pills and she threw them into the yellow garbage can. She said, you won't be needing these anymore. This is after now about a half a decade of hard addiction to this stuff, right? Walked out of her care, metaphorically speaking, and I have not touched a single pill since. I do not take alcohol to supplement it. Take a drink every now and then, no cannabis, no nothing like this. In the world around me, for people who suffer moral injury, there's the overuse of cannabis. Over-the-counter sleep aids, it's off the dial. If you do have medication, you're cross-fading it with cannabis or alcohol. It's a very, very difficult environment to be in. But when you know that there's a resolution out there, it's very, very important. In fact, it is critical that we avail ourselves of it. Because I can assure you, if you suffer and you're on medication, the medication is a mask. I don't come out completely against it because I know in some cases it's necessary. But it is a mask. The inner demon remains. And so when we look at some treatment modalities, even though they seem unconventional, they do work because I'm living proof of it. All right? It's very, very important to understand that. And for the younger people here, PTSD and moral injury, ensemble, very difficult things on the mind. They will, over time, impact your body. I look pretty healthy. I'm 62 years old, not yet combing too much gray, but physically I'm a very sick man, all right? I have all of the symptoms of a condition called Addison's disease. I've gone to the best specialists, but they can't figure out if it's Addison's or not. Now, this is the sort of thing where I can be standing here and all of a sudden not have the legs to carry myself out of the room. All right? Very serious disorder. You're knocked off your feet for 24 hours, intense fatigue. You lose control of certain bodily functions. It's incredibly embarrassing. All right? PTSD, moral injury, ensemble, this whole operational stress piece, for young people, they think it's a disease of the mind. It's much more than this. If it gets into your body, it becomes very, very difficult to cure. Very, very difficult. And I have to leave you with that cautionary note because, again, people talk too much about this as it's just mental health. It is, in fact, much, much more than this. And remember now, as probably at the end of my allotted time here, there are treatment modalities out there that I refer to as clean modalities, all right? You go, you're treated, and you walk away. The brain takes time to heal. I think it was 5 or 6 months before I really had the benefit of the journaling process. EMDR hit me right away. But these things seem unconventional. It's not like it can't possibly be medical in origin, it can't be scientific, but it is. I remember the first time, it was a funny story. I sat with my EMDR therapist, and of course there's finger waving and things like that, and I said, what is this hocus pocus? I said, just leave me alone. I said, you're not going to help me. This possibly can't cure anything. But yet it did. And I think the best cures out there are amongst the simplest, but yet they are also amongst the most complex. And I think right now we're on the cusp of doing some very, very great things. I think there's a time now to stop the semantic arguments about, is moral injury PTSD? Is PTSD moral injury? What is it? To those who are traumatized by these sorts of things, we do not care what you call it. All we want is for the torment to stop. And that's the key piece. So if it seems simple, it doesn't matter. It only matters that it works. So having said that, I will leave you to the rest of the program, and I do thank you very much for your time and attention here today. Thank you, Dr. Keenan, of course, but these things work. We always have to respect what the clinicians are doing for us. Some of them are really, really, truly great. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Assistant Commissioner Parsons. We look forward to this in our panel conversation. And now, before we move on to the documentary, I would like to quote Dr. Keenan. Moral injury develops when highly competent and principled individuals, people of service, are repeatedly exposed to events which violate their deeply held moral values and expectations. It is the most competent, compassionate, and principled people that are the most vulnerable to these kinds of wounds, as these very qualities that help them excel are also what makes them more vulnerable to being morally injured. The documentary you're about to see follows 6 combat veterans on their journey towards healing from moral injury, going through the treatment developed by Dr. Keenan. It is a tribute to the human spirit in its ever-present quest to seek both purpose and connection. As a disclaimer, the documentary has a running stopwatch displayed on the screen. For those who would prefer not to view authentic footage depicting violence, you're welcome to turn your attention away around 41-minute, 55-second mark for approximately 15 seconds. Thank you. We are ready. Thank you.
Funding for this program provided by the Yocha Dehi Community Fund. This program contains combat experiences and images that viewers may find disturbing.
I was inhuman, I'm a monster.
I remember going to buy a brand new car and I said, I don't deserve this car.
We're talking about deep guilt and shame.
I drank to forget, and I was so good at drinking that I lost my job.
In the dream, I felt everything. I saw you step on the IED right in front of me, and I saw your body blow into red and pink pieces of flesh and mist.
If you don't give me help right now, this will be the last time you will ever hear from us.
But when we're talking about moral injury, we're really talking about a soul wound.
Right? There are people suffering and dying because they're not getting treatment for this. No more.
Killing, torture, the destruction of human life. The worst humanity can dish out. We see it on the news. We scroll through it on social media. But most of us will only ever interact with this kind of violence through a book or a screen. For the next hour, we will follow combat veterans as they struggle with life-threatening guilt and shame, and the Northern California clinician who cracked the code on how to treat them as they struggle with moral injury.
There's two kinds of people in the world. There's people that are sociopaths and they have no conscience, and then there are the rest of us.
Since 1965, 12 million men and women have been asked to navigate conflicts from Vietnam to Iraq and Afghanistan. Dr. Melinda Keenan has treated thousands of them.
In the Civil War, they called it soldier's heart. And then shell shock, combat fatigue, combat neuroses. That was when it was first put into the DSM, it was called combat neuroses. And then after that, that's when it morphed into the post-traumatic stress.
Moral injury is related to post-traumatic stress, but has different neuropsychological markers. It impacts different parts of the brain, which is why Dr. Keenan and her staff say traditional treatments for PTS do not work.
Right? There are people suffering and dying because they're not getting treatment for this. No more. No more.
For the next hour, we will follow individuals whose lives have been impacted by Dr. Keenan's work, each a unique situation, but each being helped by a revolutionary treatment.
The data that we have show that it works. It reduces suffering.
Moral injuries healed through letters to the dead, and for the living, a redemption to the innocence that once made them whole.
My grandma used to have this wall that we used to call the Wall of Fame with my uncles and my dad and cousins that had served. So that always stuck with me in the back of my head. And I was like, oh, maybe one day I want to be a part of that wall. You know, I joined pre-9/11, so there was really nothing going on. I was like, the best thing I could do is probably go to Japan or something and get to see that and have fun.
While stationed in Japan and out one night partying, Diego Mendoza and his friends were called back to their Marine barracks on base.
The MPs came out into the town and said, everybody's got to get back to base. And I was like, okay, whatever. I went back into the barracks room. We saw one of the planes hit the towers. And I was like, dude, turn this stupid movie off. He's like, this is happening like right now back home. And then that's when everything really kind of sank in. Like, okay. All right, now we're not really at a peacetime military anymore.
You must be Diego.
Yes, I am.
Hi, nice to meet you. I'm Dr. Keenan.
Nice to meet you, Doc.
Come on in.
All these years later, Diego is at the Center for Post-Traumatic Growth in Rancho Cordova, California, to see Dr. Melinda Keenan.
I know it can be really hard to kind of walk through that front door.
Yeah.
So what I'd like to do just in the next maybe hour or so is just kind of get to know you a little bit. And so I'll ask you some questions, but Maybe if you could start just sort of, well, how you got here, and then maybe a little bit about what you're struggling with, so I can see how I might be able to be helpful.
I mean, I've been having a lot of trouble, like, it feels like being in my own skin.
Those problems have taken Diego through 9 alcohol rehabilitation stints, 2 psychiatric admissions, and a suicide attempt.
I feel like everything I've learned growing up is just like got thrown out the window.
Right. Exactly. That's the moral injury, is when you go into a situation where you have particular moral values that you've grown up with, and then those get turned on their head and you have to break them.
Yeah, and it feels like that's why I feel like I'm out of place.
Yeah.
Right, and it's just all this time with these just weird feelings, like, oh, helpless.
To treat him, Dr. Melinda Keenan needs Diego to go back to the exact moment of his moral injury, to identify the severed relationship that caused it, and be willing to write a letter, not about the trauma, but to the other person in that relationship, no matter if that person is friend or enemy.
And it's not.
So the way we treat here in our program is very different than lots of places, and we use group. And I know most combat vets go, I don't want to do group, because you imagine I'm going to be putting you in with a bunch of civilians.
Right.
But what we realize here is that you guys have to have other people that have walked the same walk as you to heal. And this is about reconnecting, not only with other people, but with yourself and with the person that you feel like you lost and you didn't get to say goodbye, or you feel like you harmed. So I don't know if that would be something you'd be willing to give a try.
Yeah.
Diego's objective now is to embrace his participation in the group, and then to ultimately write his letter to whoever he feels he hurt, betrayed, or killed. For men and women in combat, moral injury can come from a person's actions, sometimes from their inaction, and sometimes from a situation in which they had no options. But the resulting disaster falls heavily on their souls.
This letter is addressed to the Recon Team Flight Time and its members. Lance Corporal Douglas Barnett, Lieutenant Michael O'Connor, PFC Robert Piercy, PFC Arnold A. Skaggs, Corporal William Buck Jr., and Corporal William Wellman. On the morning of 4 July 1969, I was the radio operator on a Recon radio relay station, Foxtrot, at Landing Zone Stud. I was on duty at the relay station to keep track of all the recon teams in my area and to assist them in any way that I could. At approximately 0300 hours, a team attempted to contact me.
You were taking the first shot was taking heavy ground fire, and there's 6 more people on the ground. To the next stop.
I determined it was you, Flight Time, and that you had enemy movement near your location. I immediately contacted air control and requested air support and an evacuation of the team. At that time, all aircraft had been grounded due to bad weather, and no aircraft were available. I heard all hell break loose on the radio.
What's this for 5? This is Delta for 5-3.
There was tremendous amount of gunfire, screaming and yell going on, and I know that you guys were fighting for your lives. I was frustrated and felt helpless, but I wouldn't give up. I kept trying to give you guys encouragement. When you said on the air the words I will never forget. If you don't give me help right now, this will be the last time you'll ever hear from us. At that moment, I knew that I had failed you and that you were going to die.
Ready to pop the boat. Please fill me in on your situation. Okay, 27, I'm all out. Go ahead, just keep following the area to the north until that guy comes out. We are on station. Roger that. 5-6 my picture.
The entire unit of flight time was lost on that day in 1969.
I am so sorry that I couldn't save you. I hope you understand that I did everything I could, and I pray that you will forgive me. When I saw the 6 of you being flown in on straps under the choppers, a big part of me died along with you on that day. I was so overwhelmed with such grief and guilt that I've never recovered from that day. God took you to heaven on that morning because you had just spent your time in hell. Rest in peace, brothers. Semper Fi.
My family was in the military. I had a grandfather, my mother, my father, my uncle, and I just wanted to follow in their footsteps, and so I did. I was 17 when I joined the Navy. My first duty station was in Okinawa, Japan with 3rd Dental Battalion.
As a hospital corpsman, Sarah Malloy cared for U.S. troops overseas in much the same way they got care at home.
Somebody has the flu or somebody needs to have an ingrown toenail removed. I mean, you know, we operated as we normally would if we were stateside.
A hurricane near Haiti meant Sarah would be leaving Okinawa.
It was a humanitarian mission, and I was really excited to go and help with the hurricane.
Then, a last-minute change of plan.
So my commanding officers came to me and said that they had a spot open for deployment to Afghanistan.
Her mission would go from humanitarian to combat zone.
I was stationed at the Role 3 Trauma Hospital in Kandahar, Afghanistan. The day-to-day in Kandahar was really unpredictable. Some days were normal and just you would wake up and go to work, and then other days you would have a pager on your uniform for, let's say, a mass casualty, and everyone had to report to the hospital to assist with the incoming traumas. The level of stress, in retrospect, was really intense. So there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of commotion, there's a lot of blood, there's a lot of everything.
The days, the injuries were piling up.
I think that emotionally, under the surface, I was very unsettled, but I couldn't bring that to the surface, at least not there. And it just, all the feelings from all of the things that happened in Afghanistan stayed buried deep. You know, in the military, it's always mission first, and they drill that into your head from day one.
Another day and an urgent call. Mass casualties were being flown into Role 3 Hospital.
We got the page that it was an Alpha. The team that I was working with for the day, they went to the flight line to get the patient off of the bird, as we called it, the helicopter. And now that I'm talking about it, I recall it was a pretty busy day in the trauma bays. I remember walking out of the door into the ambulance bay to open the door to get the patient, and when I opened the door to grab the stretcher, I just remember looking up and all I could see were organs on the stretcher and blood and mid-stomach down.
The soldier had stepped on an improvised explosive device, and the bottom half of his body was gone.
I think internally, I was just begging for him not to die. I just remember seeing him and just in those moments saying, please don't die.
Sarah had been trained that if a patient made it to the hospital alive, they had a 98% chance of survival.
And so in my mind, I'm frozen, right? But my body is still moving because this guy is gonna die. He was still alive. So it was such a weird place to be.
It took her 30 minutes to stabilize the soldier for surgery.
IEDs are designed to explode and travel upwards. And so when you have an open wound and then you have all of this dirt, metal, trash, bodily waste that they put in these things, all of that goes into your open cavity and really wreaks havoc on the body. And so they took him into surgery. I know they cleaned him out really well as they could.
She never knew his name, but she knows how long he survived.
About 24 hours, and I think that his heart stopped in the ICU, presumably from blood loss. I don't remember a name or a face. I remember a feeling tied to this man, and I just felt so much. I don't know what the word would be. I don't want to say love. It got to a point where he wasn't the only casualty that was lost, and it just got to a point where all of them just started piling up, and it got to you. And I just remember sitting with my girlfriend in the Humvee, just crying hysterically and just cursing the world, cursing God and all of my beliefs and humanity. And I mean, it really just destroyed a part of me.
I knew she was pregnant before I left Japan. And she wrote me a letter.
Deployed from Japan to Kuwait in January of 2003, Diego Mendoza already knew his girlfriend was pregnant, and he would soon be a father.
I was on a machine gun team, did an enormous amount of security. And I got a letter that, my son had been born. So, I mean, that was probably the happiest day of my life, It brought a lot more hope, something to look forward to come back home to.
Diego's Marine unit was on the move daily.
We pushed all the way from Kuwait, all the way into Baghdad. I was there for the invasion. We were always on the move. There was a lot of checkpoints, a lot of clearing out little mud huts.
The letters and pictures of his new son kept coming.
It made everything worth it. It seemed like I was doing some honorary, and thinking of him and the stuff that I was going to be able to do with him and, holding him, spending time with him, sharing the pictures, with the guys and, oh, you're going to be a dad. That's awesome. You're going to be a little league coach. You're going to be able to do this. So yeah, it was I just couldn't wait to get home. Well, there's one day where we were at this checkpoint. I think it was outside of Nasiriyah, and these vehicles kept coming, and I could still see the vehicle. It was this white pickup with this railing on the sides, and it wasn't going to pull over. So I was telling it to pull over, and I was in my mind, I was I'm going to be on CNN for like blowing this truck away. And so once they pulled over, I like went over there. I was pissed. I was yelling and doing all this stuff. There was these two little kids in the back that were they were like crying their eyes out, you know, because here's this guy yelling at them and like dragging them by the arm to pull them out of the vehicle. You know, they have weapons in the family's face, and the grandpa was in the back with them, like all kind of like shaking, and I can still see their faces in my head, you know, after that. It's like, man, I really fucked these guys up for life.
The children were about 7 years old.
What I was taught was like, you're supposed to protect kids, you know, you're supposed to, you know, help them. But here I was like doing the complete opposite.
It was days later when Diego was summoned to his commanding officer's tent.
Sergeant Park was his name. I remember his name. I'll never forget that name. And he was like, "Are you Lance Corporal Mendoza?" And I said, "Yeah." And he looked at me and went, "Oh my God, I can't read this to you." And he handed it to me. And that's how I found out.
A Red Cross message with one sentence: "We regret to inform you that your son has died of SIDS."
I felt because of what I had did, like by pulling those kids out of the car or putting that fear in them, it was kind of like, okay, you do something bad, then something bad happens to you, right? So I felt I was being punished, like God was punishing me for something. That's exactly where it happened, that moral injury.
The term moral injury wasn't a part of the medical literature until the 1990s, but the first written account of the concept comes from the ancient Greek epic, the Iliad, when the hero Achilles loses his friend in battle and tortures himself with blame for not shielding his friend. It's that guilt and self-blame that turns traumatic memories into moral injury. A memory doesn't exist in a single neuron or brain cell. Each memory is stored across the brain in multiple neurons. You can think of neurons like a series of notes that make up a melody. Each melody, played in a specific way, is a memory.
It's almost a symphony of cells within an area that are encoding and creating that memory.
Dr. Sharon Furtok says in those with moral injury, the traumatic memories also light up a section of the brain called the precuneus.
The important piece about the precuneus is it's very involved with our sense of self. If we want to consider the I, like who am I, it is that sense of self. So it is very involved in conscious awareness of our ideas of self-identity and sense of self.
When we do something that violates our sense of self, it activates our precuneus. Scientists can see the activation and measure the additional energy that portion of the brain uses when someone is experiencing moral injury.
If they are recalling that memory repeatedly and having negative emotions with it, having shame, blaming themselves, that's all being integrated into that memory.
An active precuneus is one of the unique biomarkers of moral injury. But because moral injury involves our actions in relation to someone else, Dr. Keenan says the letter-writing therapy is very specific.
Unlike other trauma-focused treatments where they have people write about the incident, okay, that's a trauma account. So you write about. This is writing to, and it's writing to the person that you lost or that you believe you've harmed in some way.
Quieting the precuneus portion of the brain is key to relieving moral injury. That comes through both the writing of the letter and sharing it out loud in a group of worthy others.
And they know who they need to write to, typically, because these people are living in their heads and hearts all the time.
It's in the process, so I'm kind of in the early stages of this letter.
Carlos's military career ended with an injury from an improvised explosive device that gave him neurological damage. It makes him sensitive to light. His letter is to an enemy combatant he killed.
Your voice and face are haunting me, day and night, light or dark. Look what you made me do, as I still hear the echoes of your screams. What do you want from me? My mind keeps destroying me. And you are one of the reasons I'm losing my sleep. My decision was made before that night, and I didn't know it would be you. But if you ask me, my answer is yes. Killing you was my decision and my intentions. It wasn't easy. But I never thought that after will be this painful. I'm here trying to fix what I have broken, and you were not the only casualty, because taking the life was our exchange, and you had taken the best parts of me, my innocence, my ability to love, my pride to serve, my peace. I can see the ID hitting the vehicle that took their life. I can hear them, the loud noise and the high whistle, all in my ears. I can see their wounds. I can smell the fumes of their vehicles being blown. I can see them, but I cannot feel them. Only you, always you. So I will bring this chain to the light, so it may lose its power, perhaps subside my pain, so you can go. It's difficult to live in war, and I no longer want to fight. So I was talking to an individual in which I shot and killed, and that's the individual that I'm actually speaking to. Encompass how do I feel about myself and everything that I lost with that act.
Unless you've seen trauma or death or violence for prolonged periods of time, people don't really understand it, and it takes some of that innocence away from a person.
Home from Afghanistan and out of the military, Sarah Malloy was still in the medical industry and still dealing with the cumulative memories from her time at Roll 3 Hospital in Kandahar, Afghanistan.
When I first started talking about it, and just all of the experiences that I had in Afghanistan with all of the patients, it was such a visceral experience. Like, my throat started closing up and I couldn't stop coughing. It was really hard to talk about at first.
But it was at night, in her dreams, that the soldier missing half his body kept coming back to her.
In the dream I was in Afghanistan, and I was there when he stepped on the IED, and I just remember watching him explode into nothing in the dream. And then I remember waking up crying, and it was such a defining moment for me.
Sarah decided it was time for help and reached out to Dr. Keenan, who she found through a therapist at the VA.
Dr. Keenan talked about when we experience trauma, the three main beliefs are broken, and those beliefs are, I am good, people are good, and the world is good. And the severing of those beliefs from your mind really just takes so much away from somebody's innocence.
When Dr. Keenan asked Sarah to write a letter to reconnect with the person at the core of her moral injury, Sarah knew among all the people she had seen who she needed to write to.
I don't see his face. Forever, I see blood, I see intestines, I see bones, I see gore. I can't see his face. So I knew that I needed to write the letter to this man.
Home from Iraq, everything had changed for Diego Mendoza. His son was dead. The relationship with his son's mother had ended. He buried everything: the combat, the memories of the children he frightened, and any dreams of being a father.
Like I was taught, you don't talk about it. You kind of just keep moving forward in life.
Landscaping, construction work, and finally a job at the Department of Motor Vehicles. Life settled down, but inside Diego, a building storm. 9 years later, he heard children crying at work, and the dam broke.
I came home, and I immediately went to the bottle. Of all that stuff had just been built up, right? It was like that snowball, and I just broke. Something about hearing those babies cry took me straight back there. And I never talked about the death of my son either. So, those things kind of like coming together, I just couldn't take it anymore. And I drank to forget. And I was so good at drinking that I lost my job.
He moved to Mexico to bounce at a bar which suited his need to fight and drink, but came back to make multiple attempts at getting sober.
I went to the 9 detoxes, I went to the inpatient treatment down in San Diego for 45 days before they put me on a 5150 hold. A 5150 hold is like a psych hold that either the doctor puts you on, but I got put on by the sheriffs.
After years of daily bottles of brandy, Diego tried to take his own life.
I had some sleeping pills in my hand and a bottle of brandy, go figure. And I was planning on taking them, and I passed out. And I woke up with like the pills on the floor. So that's when I was like, okay, I don't want to say like I don't have the balls to do it, but I just knew that there was something in me that didn't want to.
Living in his parents' home at 39 years old with a string of broken relationships, Diego knew he had to get clean and he had to get help.
To see like the pain in my parents' eyes. And that's when I was like, enough is enough. I'm tired of being tired, and that's when I made the choice to live again.
Shut them up, make them quiet, stop the screaming. We did. We paralyzed their little voices and shot them full of drugs.
Wendy and her team were caring for 2 badly burned girls as their distraught mother tried to get into the hospital room.
Stop the screams, stop the anguish. We stuck and lined and whisked them away. We only stopped for 1 minute to let the anguished mothers see them as we passed out the door with our little cocoons wrapped and sequestered into silence while we whisked them away where they peeled off their skin.
The mother never saw her girls alive again.
We kept her away from them with our judgment. No touching or soothing. Oh, little girls, how different I would do it today. calculating and dosing, jabbing and cutting your little buddies apart so my machines could blow air into your lungs? Where was the soothe? The touch, the soft touch, the calming words? Lost in the command of do this and that and follow the protocols. Oh, how I wished I had stopped and whispered into your little ears.
Wendy says the girls reminded her of her and her own sister, who set fire to their room as children on accident and barely escaped when their own mother rescued them.
It was so scary. We could have been like you and your sister, on our way to heaven. I still smell the smoke.
The two events collided in that medical facility, causing Wendy's moral injury. Her letter is to the little girls.
So little ones, I'm so sorry I didn't let your mother come in to comfort you. Then maybe you would have known how loved you were and not fled your little bodies and stayed on earth.
The grief and guilt Wendy felt that day made her question her career, her humanity, and caused a constant screaming in her ears that she described as tinnitus, the screams of the little girls.
I heard screaming in my head all the time. There was always this background scream. And, you know, it was like little children screaming. And no matter what I did, I woke up with it. It just followed me around all the time. I had to really soul search and think, what happened to, you know, put that scream in my head? The burn patients downrange, remembering the incident of flying these little girls, and those all came together, and that's how the letter, you know, sort of, as I started writing, it all came together.
When you came into the hospital, I never dreamed I would see a human being in such distress. Physically, your face crossed my path of vision, and I know it looked at your face, but I didn't see it. All I could see was the carnage spilling out of your abdomen, leaking onto the stretcher, and pulling at my feet and finally resting on top of the dusty concrete. There are still drops of blood on my boots. I still wear those boots to this day. And they're the most uncomfortable boots in the world, and yet they bring me comfort, and I don't know exactly why. You came in the afternoon. The scene was chaotic. It was a mass casualty. 30 or so patients. You stepped on an IED, and from the middle of the abdomen below, you simply didn't exist. Astoundingly, you had a pulse, though weak and intermittent. It was still there, and we had it all drilled into our heads from the day we got there. If they came in with a pulse, they had a 98% chance of surviving. They rushed you off into surgery, and you were completely forgotten about in the sea of bodies that kept coming in. Hours later, we learned that you made it through surgery, and we were all so happy and hopeful. We thought of your life back home, how it would be so different, but how you'd be alive and with your loved ones, that maybe you'd smile and laugh again. Hours later, your heart stopped beating, and attempts to resuscitate you blew out the clots forming at the vestiges of your lower body, and then you died. And when we found out, we said, fuck, that sucks. And we moved on with our shift with a strange sense of normalcy, and I don't think I ever revisited the thought of you in the last hours of your life until years later when you came to me in a dream. In the dream, I felt everything I had to repress in your dire time of need. I saw you step on the IED right in front of me, and I saw your body blow into red and pink pieces of flesh and mist. I could feel myself crying, but I couldn't wake myself from the dream. I think I wanted to stay with you and try to save you. I don't know what I need to say to you to let you go, to free you from my head and my thoughts and my dreams. I'm sorry, it seems so unworthy, impersonal and shallow, and I know that nothing that I or anyone else could have done would have kept you alive. You deserved more than an apology. You deserved life, and I couldn't give you that. I pray that you and your family are at peace and that they were spared the details of the horror of your final hours that myself and so many other people witnessed. Rest in peace.
I had a camera in my hand from the time I was in high school, and I just loved photography.
At 19 years old, Stephen Stafford took his high school camera with him to Vietnam.
I photographed whenever I could, the villagers in the middle of the jungle, my platoon mates, dead bodies, of course, helicopters coming in with emergency resupplies, and every chance I had, I would take it out and take pictures.
Stephen was one of Dr. Keenan's first clients to write a letter to a North Vietnamese soldier that he killed. His moral injury came by causing the same kind of death that he was seeing through his camera lens.
I documented a lot of things, and some things I didn't document that I wish I would have, but I felt guilty taking pictures of our dead soldiers, so I didn't do that.
Stephen had spent 12 months in country and lost 17 friends. On the night before leaving for 5 days of R&R in Hawaii, he was ordered beyond the wire.
That night they sent me out on a listening post, maybe a good quarter of a mile in front of the perimeter. Well, that night at about 2 in the morning, there was a figure about maybe 10 feet in front of me, and it was pitch black, and we saw each other at the same time. And without thinking, I just opened up fully automatic with an M16. I thought, that's a point man. Never shoot a point man, because there's 100 behind him. And I was requesting to come back into the lines, and they wouldn't let me. They told me to hold the line.
Stephen stayed quiet and sat still for hours, waiting to be overrun.
When morning came, I was allowed to come back in, and I didn't even look to see what took place. I was on a helicopter going to Da Nang Air Base, and I was on a Mack airlift going to Hawaii. And it's just hard to fathom to think that 24 hours ago I killed somebody, and I don't know who they were. And now I'm laying in a hotel with a real bath, real water, real food to eat.
Stephen poured his photography and memories into a book, but until he wrote the letter to the point man he came eye to eye with before killing, his guilt and shame kept him from enjoying his life.
That weighed on me all my life. I remember going to buy a brand new car, and I said, I don't deserve this car. Anyhow.
Stephen still lives with all that happened in Vietnam, those he lost and the lives he took. But writing the letter to the point man he killed helped him move on.
Now that still filters by me daily, maybe 5 or 6 times a day. It's like a little hologram. It goes by, even after all the counseling in her classroom, but it fades. As fast as it comes, it fades. It goes away.
Before I wrote the letter, I really hated God. Like, he was like my #1 enemy.
After weeks of therapy with a group where he mostly listened, Dr. Keenan told Diego Mendoza to write his letter to the person at the center of his moral injury. Diego chose to write the letter to his dead son.
I could not ever forgive myself for the loss of my son. Never.
Diego is just a pillar of a guy. He's already soft. He'd been through some other treatment. He's very relational. He's about connection to people, and so he's a great candidate.
It wasn't part of war. It didn't have, it was this event that happened and it changed my life. I wanted to forgive myself. I just didn't know how to.
After weeks of writing and dozens of drafts, Diego was ready to read his letter to the group.
Welcome, you guys. I'm glad you're here for group. Today, Diego, you said you were ready to read your letter to us. Is that still true? You feeling ready for that?
As ready as I can be.
Yeah, I know. Okay.
We had already taken Baghdad, and I was on my way back down south on Highway 1. I had gotten news and a picture of you, and it seared into my brain. We had got to another shithole named Adiwania. That was where I would get the devastating news that you had died due to SIDS. Reading that message that day put me in a state of permanent shock. I had already seen dead children, and I even participated in dragging them out of vehicles, homes, and traumatizing them for life. That's where the Red Cross message of your death took me, and to this day still does. It's not normal to bury your child. The sacrifice I made for this country, I only thought it would be good outcomes. I remember that day where I tried to drink myself to death and shove away all this guilt, shame, and hopelessness. I remember that my heart rate was slowing down and I was fading in and out, and you said, "Dad," which woke me up and I came to. There were so many things that I wanted to do, many things with you, and one of the biggest was to meet you. I was so ashamed of not being home and not protecting you, and I didn't think I deserved anything good. Forgive me, and I'm very truly saddened and will not forget. God bless you.
The hurt that you experienced hasn't gone away. Yeah. I think the biggest thing that is helping you now is finding support and perspective as to what happened. I mean, for all of us, it's finding a way out of that, the intensity of the experience.
Community.
It's community. It's brotherhood. It's sharing the load with a brother.
It really does feel good to let it all out.
And every time you read it, something different, you'll notice something different.
Yeah.
And it moves it.
Yeah.
It can be so isolating to contain all of this. He's been with you, and he will always be with you. He will always be your son. He will never not be your son. Isn't that remarkable?
Yeah. Your letter is an expression of your humanity. Good man is experiencing a terrible event. We take it on very personally. That's the wounding we're trying to, and our morality that we're trying to resolve within our own minds.
Shame doesn't prosper, right? When we talk, when we have light, when we support each other. It breaks the isolation. It breaks the I'm a monster because of what I did, I didn't do, what I witnessed, all of that, what I've been through.
They say things like, I was inhuman, I'm a monster, I don't deserve to be loved. These are the kinds of experiences of what moral injury really is.
It's been many months since Diego first read his letter to group.
I don't feel like a horrible person. I'm not a bad father.
Diego is, in fact, a husband again and a new father to twins.
My life today is complete. It's full. I have 2 beautiful babies, twins, 1 boy, Ezekiel, and 1 daughter, Eliana. I'm sober. I'm married. I'm happy.
When asked how many children he has, Diego now says 3.
I can share that now without feeling guilty. I can share that now with pride. I can share that now with love, and I feel that it's like mended something inside of me.
Dr. Keenan's process was very difficult at first. I did not think it would work.
For 40 weeks, Sarah worked with her group in Dr. Keenan's program in Northern California, writing multiple drafts of her letter. When she read her letter to the group, it lifted a burden.
Her approach is very different in that you talk about it, and you talk about it with people who have also experienced similar events as you, and it changes the way that you carry it in your head and in your day-to-day life.
Sarah is now happily raising her son in Virginia.
Life today is great. I'm happy. I feel like I've processed a lot of the trauma that I experienced while I was deployed. It doesn't affect me the way that it used to.
The veterans in Dr. Keenan's treatment report many unexpected experiences, transformational dreams, encounters, and what Dr. Keenan calls restorative interactions.
We probably have touched about 10,000 veterans' lives, and so what we have is many, many, many people with their testimonials, much like you will see with the veterans in reading their letters about how their lives have been changed.
After I wrote that letter, you know, that part of being free started like kind of consuming like my heart and like my soul. I felt better.
For Diego, the letter reconnected him to his faith.
I actually smiled after writing the letter because I knew, and I know now. You know, I used to search for all these answers and all these ways in order to find that answer, but I never did. And I feel by writing that letter, it opened up a lot of doors in my life, but mostly to know where my son's at, and that's with God.
For Wendy, the screams of the little girls faded along with her guilt and shame.
My life has changed so much because guess what? The screaming is gone. I no longer have to live all the time. It was like having tinnitus, but it was a scream, you know, in my ear all the time, and now I don't have the scream. And also, so much of the guilt and shame has been lifted around not letting those little girls see their mom and be comforted, and my lack of comfort for them. So I think there's been so much healing, and my life is better because of it.
Dreams that ease moral injury are the most reported result.
I even had a visitation that was pretty phenomenal. That I was laying on the couch, and somewhere I was laying on the couch in my dream, but I was awake. It was like sleep paralysis. And I was awake, and this soldier walked in with a green uniform on, North Vietnamese, and he just stood there and looked at me, and I couldn't move. And then he turned and walked away, as if to say, it's okay. I would have done the same thing to you. We're good.
Science does offer an explanation for the dreams, involving how phases of sleep help add context to existing memories, like pulling a file out of a filing cabinet and adding documents before it's refiled.
After I wrote the letter and I had this dream, I got on a jet and flew all the way to Vietnam and put that letter near the same spot and left it. And I had closure.
There are experiences Dr. Keenan and her staff can't explain, and for which science has no answer. Chuck says he was visited by the 6 members of Flight Time, and he was wide awake.
I was on my way to work, and it was foggy, very foggy. And all of a sudden, I just felt like there was somebody in my car. There was some type of a presence. The further I went, it felt like more than one one presence. And I finally realized that Flight Time was with me, and all 6 of them were there. And they were happy. They were there to let me know that things were okay with them, and that they forgave me, and that they knew that I did everything that I could to try and save them. It was a happy presence, and I just knew it was them.
Peace for these veterans is the goal. The letters reconnect those severed relationships and build context around the fault they feel. It's redemption. It's restoration. It's renewal.
It's been such a gift for me to be able to help relieve some of their pain. And they've given me, the gift of trusting me with that. And then these letters, we're calling this the sacred texts of war, because there's nothing like these letters anywhere. These letters talk about what the real truths of war are and how they affect people. And I get to watch these people get redeemed. And it just they make me a better person. It's the truth about war. They're the sacred texts. They're from the heart.
We're going to take a couple of moments to set up the stage for the panel conversation, and thank you very much for spending your afternoon with us for this portion. Just going to take a few moments and we'll ask Dr. Keenan to share her.
I wanted Minnie to sit in the middle, but she's not going to do it. There are some people, obviously, in this room who do know me because I've invited them. My name is Matt Scoff. I'm the former president, retired now, of the Ottawa Police Association. My involvement with these incredible people started a decade ago. I'm going to tell the story of how moral injury is introduced to me, but before I do that, I don't think we can continue right now until Dr. Keenan says a few words about what we just saw there. I got to view this in California a couple months ago at the premiere of it, and due to a technical issue, there was a break halfway through it, and I was so grateful for that moment to just absorb what had happened. And I know we've pushed through this, and we've had a discussion around how this is going to roll out. We don't want to obviously keep everybody here forever, but I think there's an opportunity right now for Minnie to say a few words about what we just experienced there.
I don't want to take up too much time with details, but this is the culmination of my 25 years career working with veterans, and many of these veterans up there are also first responders as well. They came home from the military and they went right into either police or firefighting. So in case you feel like this might not cross over, although I believe we're preaching to the choir here, I bet you all felt it. So it was a huge blessing for me to be able to get this done. Christina Mendonza is the one who produced it. Her father was a police officer, and her uncle and her stepfather were Vietnam veterans, so she got it. She got it. What else do you want me to say, Matt? What else do you want me to say, Eva?
How long have you been doing this?
25 years. 25 years. And the program here, this is unlike the programs that we are feeding you, the mental health field feeds you, are top-down programs, okay? They're things where, the people in the white coats and the psychologists and all of us with all these letters behind our names, right, prance around and we figure out how we're gonna fix you all, right, that are suffering from these issues. Well, this is bottom up. So what you've seen here is what my people have taught me over those 25 years about what they need to heal, about what the issues are that are really keeping them stuck and keeping them feeling like there's no hope and feeling like they might want to kill themselves. As you saw, Diego had a suicide attempt. Wendy herself came into treatment. The critical care flight nurse, she was at a conference giving a nursing talk and was in a hotel that had a high-rise, and she goes, I just felt like I was just going to walk to the edge of the balcony and throw myself off. And I couldn't even really put my finger on why, other than, of course, 24 hours of screaming, children screaming in her ears, And traditional folks, if you went to somebody like a psychiatrist and said, I'm hearing children screaming in my ears, they're going to go, you're psychotic. And they're going to give you a bunch of medicine. You're crazy, because that's a psychotic symptom. No, it's not. That's a symptom of trauma. That's those children calling her, letting her know that there needs to be a conversation between she and that person, those kids, right? Is that good?
It's really profound. 12 years ago, since 2012 to about 2014, I was just starting to serve in my role and capacity as a police association president. And for those unfamiliar with it, it's a union representing the members' interests, advocacy, etc. Back in that time, and in some ways it seems an eternity or a blink, there was no programming around peer support. There was very little programming with the employer or even a thought from the employer, and not just Ottawa, this was across the province, obviously, from a civil service perspective around managing or supporting their employees, their own members. The association was this default organization and obviously not clinical, just so everybody know. I in no way have any clinical experience or training as well. It was the default organization for members to turn to when requesting assistance, crying out for help. So for a couple of years, as I'm making every best effort to support the members, and of course, my own response as well is, are you seeing a doctor? Which I can tell already as they're coming to me. Yes, they already have access to a doctor. They're coming to me for another reason. It's almost, I feel very insulting to say it to them around, please seek medical help. This is very anecdotal, it's only from my own experience, and I just want to preface that, and understanding that I do have a prepared portion where I will explain it scientifically, I guess, what our steps were. And I, of course, had to write that down because there was no way I was going to remember that. From my own observations and experience, I was, in a way, able to break it into categories, member, as much as, again, I was making an analysis of it, suffering from, as their own declarations around addictions, feelings of depression. But there was this element, and if I was breaking them into categories, I would say a third around overt addictions, and then a third of this self-declared medical, depressed state that they were experiencing. But there was this significant portion, at least a third, that could not, I had a hard time putting my finger on it. The member had a hard time articulating it. They were experiencing issues within their own personal lives, but a lot had to do with work. They were so frustrated with their experiences with the organization and how the organization was treating them. They would be in conflict with authorities within the organization. And then 10 years ago, and of course I'll point to Eva there, but I know she's not necessarily going to want to take any credit for this, of course. I was introduced to Mindy and the term moral injury. And it was an absolute light bulb epiphany moment for me when it was explained around the concepts of institutional betrayals. And understanding that, and I will definitely not, I'll ask Mindy to rephrase it, but my understanding is around the I'm good, so your own personal moral compass that you may have fractured. My colleagues, we are good, or they are good, your friends, or they have transgressed against you. And then that third pillar of the institution, the power, the authorities that have absolute control, and in the public service realm, that is a reality that, and again, obviously I'm speaking from a policing perspective, but it does translate to the colleagues that I've spoken to and other public service organizations, medical, frontline, paramedic, and fire, is the organizations that abuse that authority where the member, the employee of the institution, has had absolute faith in that organization that betrayed them. And how they were to reconcile with that, how they were to believe that they could spend a career in that organization, which started to lead to them realizing that they were not going to be able to make it without help. And when I was introduced to this term, the moral injury concept, we had already started navigating a peer support program business case. The association presented it to the employer, and this is going back again 10 years ago. This was the forerunner of development. We didn't invent peer support, let me be clear, but we were taking it from the military, people who had already started to look at this type of programming. And we were paralleling two different business cases at the same time. We were looking at peer support, but knowing that peer support had a limit when we had a significant issue around moral injury treatment. And so I know there's clinicians here. This is when I was introduced to the DSM scale. What is it, DSM what now? No, sorry, what number? We're at 5? Okay, 5, right. Yeah, I don't even remember the term, and I'll tell you why, because this was for me eye-opening. How did I get our members help when moral injury is not on the DSM scale, which I found out? So a doctor may be live to it. Clinicians may be aware that the only way to get a member or a patient help is to put it under PTSD. And years ago, when I met Ches, in my role, he was still RCMP at the time. We were having these moments, sharing these experiences from an institutional level, trying to have our members receive assistance, and knowing full well that they were being classified under PTSD as their injury, because the WSIB model doesn't recognize moral injury because it's not on the DSM scale. So, and in some cases, misdiagnosed, just genuinely misdiagnosed with PTSD because of a lack of awareness around the concept of moral injury. So how did we go about trying to make the awareness within the membership so that they could articulate or provide to their doctor something to help navigate or tailor their treatment process? And am I okay to continue with this, or do you want me to give it to Mindy now and then we'll ask the questions afterwards?
Of course, yeah. I just outline how did we get here to understand that we do have an issue with moral injury in terms of the research.
That's okay, so that was the prepared. I just wasn't sure if that was afterwards in the Q&A, so. It's in 20 font anyways, just so everybody knows, so I didn't have to put on any reading. So we administered 2 surveys, and this is to a demographic of 2,000 active members, so both police officers and civilian members, and in around 700 retired members. Same breakdown, about 2/3 former sworn members and 1/3 civilian membership. This demographic were shift workers, day shift workers. There were people who worked weekends, some people who floated through, so it was and again, sworn and civilian, so it was a very broad demographic of people. So we administered the surveys both in 2015 and 2019, and both times we used validated tools to screen for PTSD. In 2019, we added a tool to screen for moral injury. And we learned that in as much as prevalence of PTSD is already very high in policing, comparatively to the general population, which is nearly 20% for policing, the moral injury was more than double that, at 40%. And we had a significant amount of participation. In fact, I've been advised by several people in this room that they personally told me over the years that they did participate in these surveys. They were shocking numbers, and shocking as in statistically when you see it on paper, it's hard to absorb. But it validated the numbering that I had imagined. In fact, it was over the amount where I had put at least 33%, like so 1/3 of our members, in a situation where PTSD was not describing their experience like an overt trauma. There was something so insidious and lingering in them that they could not move forward in treatment. They were stuck in this paralysis and this frustration, which led to obviously issues at home as well as issues professionally. And with that, I would like to turn over, I believe Dr. Keenan is, or did you have do I have another question?
Last one, your recommendations. Because if you laid the groundwork, what would be your recommendations to navigate the employee-employer relationships when it comes to wellness and health and moral injury?
So we debated how to encourage our members to participate in this type of programming. There is obviously a reluctance in the people of service to come forward with issues to participate in programming, and so I'll get a little selfish and talk within the policing profession. There's an incredible reluctance to do so. Culturally speaking, it is still quite a taboo to come forward and talk about it. So we specifically, and again, in consultation with medical professionals, what was universally experienced with both trauma-based like PTSD moral injury, or those that didn't even qualify within either of those two categories, was fatigue. 100% of the respondents, and we're talking a significant number, all experienced significant fatigue. So we specifically designed programming that in itself, titled the Fatigue Management Strategy, was to bring people within to participate, to start looking at their fatigue, which was then the ability for the medical professionals to then say, through fatigue, dealing with your fatigue, and again, so I'm saying this not clinically, so somebody else please feel to fill in the gaps that I'm completely going to miss here. Dealing with the fatigue was at least the gateway in to beginning the process of acknowledging what other issues you may be experiencing. And through our tools that we administered, that the professionals, again, not us, the clinical professionals running the surveys and the diagnostics, they were able to determine within a high degree of success what the member was potentially suffering from. Moral injury, trauma, addictions, et cetera, or actual physical sleep apnea, or what other causes, or other issues, sorry. They were able to take that document as a diagnostic tool, as a broad but still diagnostic tool, to provide to their clinician to begin their treatment process. And that was how successful this entire program was for us, to show our members were able to validate their concerns, see it on paper, saying, I just knew something was up, and then go to whoever they were comfortable with. We had trained professionals as well too. We had taken the time to engage a clinic, train them on the culture so that they were ready for the potential experiences of what our membership may be suffering from. But again, obviously members have a comfortable relationship, and that being able to choose your clinician is very important, obviously. And they were able to provide that to somebody that they already had a familiarity with or wanted to have treatment by, and take that diagnostic result and provide it to their clinician. It was, again, not being a clinician, I found that incredible that we were able to not just encourage the members, make them comfortable to actually treat what they might be going through. And it was all through fatigue management. It was critical for us to have the buy-in, the comfortableness, because they're not always going to, well, in fact, a lot of times they are not going to go to the programming that the employer provides. There's a hesitation, there's a mistrust, there's this concern, and especially if they've already been betrayed or feeling of betrayed by the institution, they wouldn't approach the employer, which was so critical for the supportive advocate of the association's leadership cadre and my board of directors to take this programming on and be the leader within it, so that the members could at least feel, and not every member like me, I fully admit that, I mean, but at the very least, there was this belief that of the two entities, the association was the safer route. And as we were able to spearhead this, we also were able to navigate around, even though our members worked in a public service environment, we were able to navigate around engaging key people, properly vetted clinicians, without having to go through that fictional RFP process that usually just ends up being the one who wins the contract, ends up being a buddy of a buddy, etc., or the cheapest proposal forward. So it was a, if I was to encourage anybody in this room on how to bring this forward or consider it in your own organization, it would be to navigate it through the entity that's not subject to the public service rules. The association or the union is a not-for-profit, has nothing to do with public service, and it's the advocate for the members. So it was critical to have that, our involvement in it, for its success.
Thank you. Dr. Keenan, we are very glad to have you here today. For the sake of time, what I would like to do is to read the questions for you. I understand that you may not be able to answer them all, and we have agreed collectively as a group that all of the questions that have come forward to you will be then answered on our webpage. We'll have a conversation That includes you, Matt. There are many more for you, but whatever we can get through in your time.
If I may?
Yes.
I would love to hear what Daniel and Chess and Jesse thought of the film, because they hadn't seen it. I'm already an advocate, right? I'm already biased. I'd like to hear what these guys. Is that okay?
Of course,
I will,
absolutely.
but I will be glad to answer any questions.
Of course.
You guys need to have a voice in this. What did you?
I thought it was great. No. Yeah, is this thing on? I turned it off. No, it's still good. Magic touch, I guess. Wonderful. No, it's a very interesting piece, and I'll go back to what I was when I gave the keynote here. I'll go back to the issue around this diagnosis piece. It's not working again.
This would be a coincidence.
No, it's still not working. Can you hear me? Move your hand up. You're probably going to a little higher. Is it working now? Yes. Thank you. All right. I'll start over. So just to go back to the keynote piece, we talked about, like, I do have PTSD. I've been diagnosed for it. I went through all the treatments and things of this nature. When you look at the treatment program, the modality in this film is completely different than anything you would normally think you'd be exposed to. I had a version of it from a different clinician. But because I was treated with the EMDR for the PTSD, when there was a residual, when the symptomology wasn't, when it didn't clear up, that's when the pill started. All right? I spent basically 4 years almost as an addict. Probably I was, I don't know. And still had to function at a very high level at a senior executive position. It was extremely, extremely difficult. So this is when we get into what's going on in this film. You've got to see that there's a different approach out there. And if you just look at people with PTSD and say, you've got PTSD and this is what we're going to do for you, you had to be very, very careful. Moral injury tags itself to PTSD events because they're always problematic, there's always difficulties. You're haunted by, did you do the right thing or the wrong thing? With my trainer's suicide, I feel guilty to this day. I did not do enough. That's a moral injury, it's not PTSD. Going to the house and looking at the scene is PTSD. And it's very, very important. This is why this is so critical, okay? I wasn't treated properly clinically, to no fault of anybody's, but it just doesn't show up as what you should be doing with PTSD. So then they start giving a person who's not depressed strong antidepressants. And I can assure you now, before I pass the microphone down the line here, when you get into the world of pills and you don't need them, it's a very strange experience. And right away, you begin to develop some alarming tendencies with sleeping pills, like crossfading with alcohol. And I'm not a drinker, but I can assure you, if you take the one, I won't name the brand, but if you take 2 hits and 2 ounces of whiskey, it's like falling backwards into a vat of warm milk. Don't try it at home. It's not family entertainment, but it did not help me. Everybody's hearts were in the right place, but I was not treated for the moral injury. If I had been, then I wouldn't have had to go through that. And I'll leave it at that. I think the film's a work of art. It's fantastic. It sheds light on a crisis and a condition that, for first responders in particular, it kills more of us than anything else. Remember that.
So my name is Dan. There we go. My name is Dan Sundal. I'm paramedic, retired, well, still not active, but still registered paramedic, advanced care paramedic, and retired firefighter, and now a new counseling therapist. I also create artwork under the name Dan Sun. So a little bit about my story, and I'm so happy that Ava asked me to be part of this this panel, because I was really doing a deep dive on core values and how that relates to treatment of trauma and the idea of moral injury. So the universe seemed to just compile and just seemed to make this happen, which I'm very grateful for. But I became a primary care paramedic, an EMT at that time back in 1996, and then a full-time paramedic, advanced care paramedic, and firefighter in 2003. And in 2014 is when I was first diagnosed with PTSD. And that's when I started creating the artwork as a part of my therapy, as a way to get these images in these haunting, I call them organic monsters that invaded my consciousness uninvited, and I was able to trap them in these two-dimensional images. And it was part of my therapy, and I created it authentically in order for it to be part of my recovery process. And 2021, the symptoms started to come back. And then my psychologist said, "Hey, Dan, you're done. You're not working on the ambulance anymore. You got to do something else." And to be honest, I was ready. And then I decided to go back to school and become a counseling therapist, which I am now. And during that time, I was psychoanalyzing myself, just realizing these are the things that happened to me. And when I started thinking about moral injury, I realized that for me, it was not so much the patients that I had that really stuck with me. It was the periphery. It was the people around. It was the witnesses. It was the bystanders. It was the family members that really kind of stuck with me. Those are the things that really haunted me. And now when I travel, I'm very lucky and very blessed that I get to travel and exhibit my artwork and speak with thousands of other first responders. I ask them, what are some of the things that really stress you out about this work? And the majority of them say it's not so much the calls that they go on, it's the periphery, it's the workplace stress, it's the people they work with, it's family, it's their perceived idea. And when I say perceived, I don't mean it's not real, but it's their sense of sanctuary trauma, really. And so I've done, as a therapist now, I'm trying to do a deep dive on what this actually means and finding ways to best help my clients now in this concept, in the context of sanctuary trauma, core values, and moral injury, and what that all means together, because that really seems to be a prominent theme when I speak with many of my peers when I travel. So that's what I'm trying to educate myself on now to better provide for my clients. And it's been really, really interesting. And this documentary is fantastic. It gave me a lot of clarity. And I love the idea of writing, the sacred letter and writing it to the person that the clients feel they've betrayed. And I can see how that is very relative to how I can use that for my clients. So I think it's wonderful.
Thanks, everybody. Hi, my name is Jesse Henneberry. I'm a registered psychotherapist with the counseling group at Jewish Family Services. And thank you, Ava, for organizing this. Thank you, Mindy. Thank you to the rest of the panel. It's an honor to be here. So I just wrote some thoughts down I wanted to share. Like I say, I've been a therapist for 14 years, but I wanted to reflect on my own experience with moral injury that happened a few years prior to my starting my education in psychotherapy. I think it speaks to the importance and applicability of Dr. Keating's approach in supporting people in our communities, people of service, because it is sorely needed. So watching the documentary had me reflect on my own values, and probably the biggest value that's been instilled since I was born that I can remember is a deep respect for public medicine. I was born very, very sick. Chronic asthma. I was premature about 3.5 months, so I spent probably about a year, close to a year, in an incubator in the NICU when I was just born, and then on portable oxygen for the first 2 years of my life, and then in and out of the ER for about 5 years with asthma attacks. So my family growing up has always said, the medical system has saved you. You're here because of it. We're very lucky. We should be grateful. It was also ingrained because a family friend was an ER nurse who lived up the street, my mom's best friend. So there was a lot of medical talk growing up. And I had a family member who had a stroke when I was 15 and had to be airlifted to McMaster University Hospital from Burlington, and luckily survived, had emergency brain surgery. So again, this message has been reinforced over and over for me. So about 2 years before I started my education as a psychotherapist, I wanted to give back and volunteer at an ICU in the hospital, so I did. And the first 3 training shifts went well, but when I did my first solo shift, I think that's when the moral injury happened. It was an evening shift, Friday, I think it was like 6 till 10 I went in. And so I walked into the ICU to the clerk at the desk, and she gave me a list of patients and said, there's a family who's waiting in the family lounge right now. Their child has had a very bad diving accident, and the child will die within 48 hours. They don't know this yet. The surgeon is going to come and tell them while you're on your shift. So just to prep you for that, that's going to happen. So I thanked her. I took the clipboard with my notes and walked out of the ICU into the family lounge down the hall. And I walked in and there was nobody there. And about 2 minutes later, there was a sound of a door opening. There was a quiet room within the family lounge. And the surgeon was already there and had told the family what was going on. Kind of simultaneously as I was being told by the ward clerk. And he immediately sees me and says, "Oh good, the volunteer's here. He'll take it from here, he can help you." And then he was gone. And I thought, I'm 23, I have no experience. What can I do? So the parents rushed up to the desk and said, when can we see our child? So I called the ward clerk, and they said, no, the nurses are on shift change, and call back within 45 minutes and we'll try again. And so that was basically what happened for the whole 4 hours of that night. That was the only family with me there, and every time I called, they weren't allowed in. And so they were obviously very upset. They would be pacing the halls, yelling, banging on things. But the thing that really stays with me is that they would walk by and stand in the doorway and kind of look at me and smile, even though they'd just been given this horrible news. And I thought, I think about that a lot because I do a lot of trauma and grief work as a therapist, and it really highlights the value of just being with people in these very horrible moments. And at the end of the night, at 10 o'clock, my shift ended. I went home. They were still waiting. I came back the next week. They were gone. I think the moral injury here was that the medical system that has always saved me and been so great to me, I was now part of a system that could not help these people. And it just wasn't possible. And I think back to it now, I'm 41, but I would not put a 23-year-old in that situation now. It just feels like too much. I was also reflecting on kind of, Mindy, your approach and how I think it can be useful to people of service in community. I think if I would have had access to that approach at that time, it could have been really helpful. Perhaps I could have written a letter to the child that died or to the surgeon that left. But I think ultimately I would have written it to the family themselves and how I wish I could have given them the medical help that's been given to me. I really do think that the community social services, public mental health can benefit a lot from the work that you do with the letter writing. Around the same time I was volunteering at the ICU, I did night shift at a shelter and just seeing trauma after trauma. And I feel like there's been a change in how we talk about these things. Almost 20 years ago, like we didn't speak about trauma so openly in civilian public life, I don't think that seems to be changing. And I wonder if a similar thing needs to happen with moral injury. Because I think if we were able to meet people who work, in public health, public mental health, social services, public transit, we'd hear a lot of stories if we give them a definition of what moral injury is, and they would say, oh, I get that, and I have a story to tell you. So I also just think that the letter writing thing in groups sounds very, very interesting, and I think it could do a lot of great help for people. In addition to doing ongoing therapy with people, I work at a walk-in counseling clinic, so often seeing people briefly 1 time, 3 times. And I've been doing it for 10 years. It can be quite intense work, but the reason I love it so much is we have a team of therapists who are supporting each other. And I think that teamwork aspect of it would be very applicable in the group setting when you're writing the letters and sharing with people, because I think that's how we get through such difficult, horrible things, is to go through it together. So those are just my thoughts. So thank you very much.
%1,000%. By the way, you can still write the letter to the family. Right, I have Vietnam vets that are, 60 years post, and you can still do it. So 2 things that I want to highlight, and then questions? Okay. The first thing I want to highlight is what these guys were saying about moral injury, Matt saying not in the DSM. That's because it's not a disorder. It's not a diagnosis. It's not about being defective or broken. It's about being a human being who is doing an impossible job. And if you think about it that way, and the way your roles conflict with what you would do, just example, Wendy. Wendy was the critical care flight nurse. What was her job, right? Daniel, her job was to save those girls, right? Or do whatever they could, even though they knew they probably weren't going to save those girls, right? But they were supposed to do everything they could to save them. And as she went backwards, if I, Wendy, wished I would have been able to let the mother comfort her children, knowing that they were going to die, instead of staying in my role. But the role, that's where the conflict can occur. So it's really good people, as Eva talked earlier about, that are vulnerable to this. So as long as we're human beings, there's going to be moral injury. And as long as there have been human beings, there's going to be moral injury. So this is as old as the hills. So this is not a disorder, and this is something that you should not be ashamed of seeking help for. This actually means you're an incredibly good person who's suffering because of things you couldn't do or had to do at the hands of the universe, the institution, other people, however you want to look at that. And then the other piece I want to highlight is that this film focuses on more what I call the sort of the classic moral injury, which is having to break your own moral values. But as Matt alluded to, there's also 2 other layers, one of which is betrayal trauma, which is when people who are supposed to have your back don't, and they actually perpetrate against you. And then the third is the institutional layer, where that betrayal becomes part of the culture of the institution. It becomes expedient to blame the individual rather than having the powers that be have to take responsibility for the positions that they're putting you in. And so if you look at the trifecta of those things, and as each level, as we go along, actually the classic moral injury is the easiest to treat, and then as we go up the ladder, and the institutional one is one of the more difficult ones because we're not going to change. We're not going to change the culture of government. We're not going to change the culture of healthcare on a vast scale immediately anyway, right? So we are in a position of being a peon. And what we're really outraged about is the harm that this is causing, not only to you as an individual, but to other people you're witnessing, right? So the treatment involves very delicate
place where you have to encourage the person, validate their experience of being betrayed, but get them to pivot away from focusing on their rage at the system back to their compassion toward the victims, including themselves and the other people that they saw. So that is a difficult piece. But I know there's quite a few questions in there that were along the lines of the institutional betrayal, right, Emma?
Yes, they have been, and I'm trying to reorganize them as you speak, because I think the greatest value would be with you simply continuing to talk. I just would like to give you a couple of points that people brought to our attention. I think one key piece is, where do we start? What do we focus on? How do we prioritize this massive undertaking, considering the system and the setup? And obviously, for people to be trained to be able to deliver service or to be able to access the service, that seems like a very daunting task. So what would you suggest to anyone who is dealing with moral injury or is helping someone? Where do we start? Where are the resources? How do we access this? How do we sort this out?
Well, I'm just a lowly clinician. I ain't no policy person, but I think that Chez's remarks early on, it has to start from the bottom up. It has to be a grassroots thing. This is not something where, all of a sudden these people are going to go, oh, wait a minute, we're screwing people up and we've got to shift how this happens, right? Because there's politics, there's money, there's power, there's all this stuff. But I think that just by introducing the concept of moral injury with your peers, if you're seeing it happening and starting to talk about it as this not being a disorder, and that there is treatments if you've been through it, like these guys are saying, that what's helped, right? Because the worst thing is when you get sent to a provider for a problem that you've come and said, okay, I'm having trouble, and let's say they label it PTSD, and you go and you get the treatment, and it doesn't help. Like Chez is saying, it's leaving those big three, unresolved loss, guilt, and shame, untouched, which many of the treatments for PTSD do. Then you start to feel like you're a lost cause. Okay, because a lot of times with PTSD, with in the mental health field, we talk about cognitive behavioral therapy, cognitive processing therapy, and prolonged exposure. These are, quote unquote, our gold standards for treating this. Okay, and then when they fail, the person thinks, well, okay, if this is the best they've got, I'm way too screwed up to be helped, so there's no hope for me. And then guess what? You go home and you start your weapon, right? Because you think there's no hope. But when we identify the right pathways, when we identify the right struggle, and again, if you could see in the moral injury piece, I think Chez's remarks about not doing enough was the moral injury, viewing the brain splatter on the wall is PTSD, but I think they go hand in hand, right? They get linked up like you're talking about. But Diego, for example, his trauma was nothing having to do with blood and gore. This is about the human connection. So it was about his baby, right? And losing his baby without being able to feel like he was responsible in some way for that death, That's the moral injury. And the most important key pieces, and this is where the letter writing comes in, is that this is between people. I think even the field now is still talking about moral injury as being an intrapersonal problem. This is your problem to fix. And so they haven't been able to come up with a solution for how to really do that. So sometimes, the chaplains have come along and said, we'll do random acts of kindness, or there's people, okay, we need to do a retreat, and you need to do yoga, and you need to ride horses, and you need to, there's all these different things that help, but nobody has really identified the real core, which I believe is the breach between human beings, because trauma doesn't happen in a vacuum. PTSD can happen in a vacuum. So you're a combat vet, and you're on a big base, and you never kill anybody, you never pull a trigger, you don't see anybody die, but they're dropping bombs on you, and you're afraid for your life every day. That can be PTSD without moral injury. Okay, But that's rare because most of the time, even with PTSD, it's involving the other person. And so you feel like you've lost them and you haven't been able to help them, or you feel like you've transgressed against them in some way through action or inaction. Okay.
Just to help us with common language a little bit, and this is the first round of questions for you. What are you looking at when you are looking at moral injury? What are you listening for? What does it look like? Just so we kind of get into because I think we all may be thinking about our own experiences, but what are you looking at if you're looking at moral injury?
Well, I think those three, the unresolved loss, I lost somebody and I didn't get to say goodbye, Diego. But very often that bleeds into the guilt where you feel responsible in some way. So, for example, Ches with his trainer, right, suicide, you're always like, I should have seen it coming. That's the kind of language. I feel responsible. A lot of times people will say too, I know this doesn't make sense, but, right? I know in my head I couldn't have done anything different. But it doesn't feel like that here in my heart, okay? So we're talking about the language of interpersonal connection, the language of attachment, Jesse's story is a beautiful one too, of him not feeling like he could help the family, and he did everything he could. He used every resource he had. He figured out resources he didn't even have, right? He was thrown into the deep end of the pool, and yet 20-something years later, he's still going, now I'm thinking, I wish I would have been able to just tell that family, because they were gone, see? Right? He was in that. They were together. They were in the worst moments of that family's life. They were bonded together like that, and he was thrown in, not expecting that, not having the tools, and then all of a sudden they're gone. And he's like, what happened, right? Our story is not finished. So the letter allows you to bring the story full circle, and that's where the healing comes from. And when you heard Sarah's story about, I didn't see his face, and all I could remember was blood and guts, but she goes, I don't know what this feeling was about this man. I don't want to say love, but guess what it was?
Love.
It was love. She was attached to him in that moment as a human being. And so it's when those people, even though they're supposed to be numbers, sometimes they're already dead too, but you attach to them. They become part of you, and you can't separate it. And so a lot of times with the PTSD and with the limbic stuff, that's the limbic versus the precuneus, right? The limbic is the PTSD stuff. That's the rapid firing, that's the flashbacks, that's the hyperarousal, that's the waking up at night in the sweats, that's all that stuff, right? But the precuneus is about your attachment to other people and who am I? Who am I in relationship to others? And so it's a whole different ball of wax. I don't know where I was going with that, but I got stuck in the precuneus, I don't know, somewhere.
Before we open to the floor, could you just briefly describe the actual treatment that you provide, just to give us a sense of what does it look like to go through your treatment?
Well, the little group that we did, that was a microcosm of what we do, but actually those three other men that were in the group with Diego had not heard Diego's letter. They didn't know him. So they were literally doing this. Those other three men were in a group together. They were literally doing it on the fly for the thing. But they did that's what happened in the group process. So we do a 3-phase group thing. But so we do psychoed up front, which is about 3 months, where we talk about the difference between PTSD and moral injury. We talk about how we treat. We talk about how we view it. We talk about related stuff, dreams, nightmares, anxiety, depressions. But really what we're doing is we're prepping them to be in group together and develop a common language. And so they get to know each other a little bit. That's when then we put them into phase 2, and that's the letter writing phase. And so we do that once a month for 9 months. And I know that sounds like a really long time, but it goes by like that. And
one of my group folks once said to me, Doc, he's like, 40 weeks, Doc? You know what that is, right? 40 weeks is gestation of a child, of a baby, of a new birth, right? 40 weeks. Yeah. And Sarah, that little boy that she has, her son, she actually got pregnant on the first week of trauma group. She found out she was pregnant. She had him right before they finished trauma group. When we started filming this is now at least 6 years later, probably. She was actually pregnant with her second baby during the time we filmed this, and she had him right when we did the premiere in September. She's like, I wanted to come so bad, but she's like, that's my due date. So this is an organic process that is beyond description, and the most important aspect is that you're not only reconnecting, when you write the letter, you're reconnecting with the person that's not here, but these other people are your witnesses, and you all have people that we then carry with us, okay? We all remember Sarah's guy. We all remember the little girls, right? I had one guy once tell me, I feel like we have this circle of us here, and then there's an outer circle of all the other people, right, Daniel? Of the families, of the what'd you call them? Auxiliary? The bystanders, but the people that have the ripple out effect, right? So it's not only the people that they lost, but they become then part of honoring them, and that shifts them from the blood and gore to being able to remember them as whole people, and that's what the dreams always are. And these things just come up. I'm just reporting it. I can't tell you. And that thing with the flight time, I mean, so almost always after they read this letter in the group out loud, they get some kind of response back, and it's usually a dream. But in Chuck's case, one foggy morning, when he was driving into work as a cop at the federal courthouse, flight came to visit him. Oh, and then the third phase is kind of an aftercare, so we're easing you down, out. We don't just kick you out right at the end of trauma group, right?
Is there support for family and loved ones?
Yes, we have developed a whole family program because you can't treat any of this stuff in a vacuum. Your families are going through it with you every step of the way, whether you think they notice or not. They know more than you think they know. So yes, yeah, that's imperative.
Okay. What I would like to do is to open this to the floor for questions and comments. And I will encourage our viewers to email any comments, any questions to the webpage www.moralinjury-ottawa.ca, and we will continue this conversation past this event, as obviously this is way too much information to go through in just 2 hours. But for now, I would like to see if there's anyone in the audience who would like to ask questions or comment.
Thank you. Dealing with all the stuff that you deal with, what do you do to make sure you're okay?
I get that question all the time. Well, I think Jesse hit on one part of it, is that everything we do in our program is about relationship. So we are a team of people, and we are constantly together as a team, debriefing, things like that. The other thing is the way that this process works, when you do a group, a shared burden becomes a lighter. So it's not like I'm a trash can that everybody's coming in and just throwing all this stuff in. It's a whole different experience. We are all doing this together, and people get better really fast, actually, in comparison to for how long they've carried this. So it doesn't land on me. And people of service are always sure they're going to poison people around them, because they feel poisoned. They feel like they're going to poison their therapists. They feel like they're going to poison their families if they talk about it. But putting them in a group too, where other people have walked the walk and they've they realize that they're not alone anymore is another huge piece. So for me, it's an uplifting thing. Every day I get to see them get better. Yeah. Do you guys want to comment on that?
Yeah, I want to comment on that. Sorry. Yeah, Jesse and I were just talking about before the documentary, and I mentioned that as a paramedic going through school, and I don't know if it's changed, I doubt it's changed that much, but as a paramedic going through, we didn't really learn a lot about self-care. Maybe a couple segments of a textbook, but as a counseling therapist, we learned a lot about self-care. There were several courses we took, there were several textbooks that we had to read on how to better take care of ourselves while we're helping people that we're working with. Yet and I assume it's probably the same for policing as well, but fire EMS at 20 years ago, more than 20 years, we did not really spend a lot of time on how to take care of yourself and prepare yourself for the things that you're going to see. And I think that might be, the result of a lot of the things that we're seeing now. I think now if educational institutions spent more time on, what is moral injury, how do you do preventative self-care instead of doing the disease model of, okay, well, let's take care of ourselves when we get sick. Let's do a preventative measure. And I like using this example of and emergency services and paramedics will get this, EMTs will get this. We're not going to put together our advanced airway kit the first time we have our critical asthma patient. That's not when you put together your intubation kit and whatnot. You do that all preventatively. Yet we don't do that for mental health. So I always tell my clients and all my first responder friends that I go talk to, I'm like, do you have a therapist? If you don't have one, find one, interview them. Most therapists will do a free 15-minute consultation. And if you contacted them and say, hey, I'm shopping around for a therapist in case I need one, and ask them like a job interview, why do you want to work with first responders? What experience do you have? How available are you? Do it like an interview so that when you are traumatized, if you get traumatized, and you're looking for someone for help, you already have that preventatively done. And I think that's, I personally think that's very, very helpful. And a lot of people have done that. Do you have any comments?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think working with a lot of trauma, grief, heavy stuff, it's definitely ingrained in us in school to go to therapy ourselves, really have a plan for self-care. And I find just being mindful of what media I'm consuming, because if I have a really heavy day with a lot of clients who are traumatized, then I gravitate a lot to comedy to try to get my mind off of it too, and knowing who good friends and family in my life that I can turn to, and just exercise too is very helpful. So, yeah.
Any more comments or questions? Oh.
Hi, my question's for Dr. Keenan. I just was wondering, what your approach is for people that deal with, multiple types of moral injury. So, more so, focused on, the institutional moral injury that's preventing them from dealing with, personal moral injury, if that makes sense.
Well, I think that's where it takes some skill, That's where it's about having had enough people under your belt where you can walk the tightrope of making sure that you're not invalidating their experience with that, but helping them to understand why railing against an institution for the rest of their life is just going to make them sick. You have to get them, because what they're railing against, what their rage is about, is that the institution is not only harmed them, but it's harming other people as we speak. And so we've had people too, I think one of the questions was along the lines of, what if you've reported it and they've turned on you and ruined your career? I think that as long as you're staying in that rage place, the Vietnam veterans got stuck in that really easily because we mistreated them so badly, right? We blamed them, called them names and all that stuff. But until they were able to really turn away from the perpetrators and say, I'm not giving you any more of my energy is going to go to my self-healing and my doing what I can to heal my brothers and sisters, which is to be supportive of them, to talk about your journey, to normalize their experience and say you're not alone in this thing. Because the other thing we do at our clinics, we treat a lot of military sexual trauma. You want to talk about moral betrayal trauma and institutional betrayal. Here you are where you're going into, a lot of times, fleeing an abusive situation at home to go into the military where you think, okay, I'm going to make a career, and these people are going to be my family and take care of me and have my back, and then they are sexually assaulting you, and then you're the one who's blamed and run out, your career's over, right? So what I do with them, though, is I help them be able to talk to the perpetrator, but in a way where they're casting them out. They're not. What happens with people with blame is they get so consumed in that rage. So I don't know if you guys have any recollection of Cindy Sheehan. She was a lady that sent her son to combat he went to combat in Iraq right after George Bush sent us all over there to get the weapons of mass destruction, and he was killed. And she became so focused on George W. Bush, that she couldn't see anything else. She spent her whole life trying to, write him, put crosses in the yard of the White House, and getting arrested and all these kinds of things. But I think that her rage, she got physically sick. She lost her marriage, and I think she lost her son in the whole thing too. I don't think she ever really was able to mourn him properly because she was so hyper-focused on the perpetrator. And I so get it, right? That's so human. But you really have to be able to show them that the path forward is about healing your wound and telling the perpetrator to piss off, right? Right? I know that's probably not a satisfactory answer. We want to have something else, but it's a lot of work. Yeah. But yeah,
Anecdotally, to your question, and again, non-clinical, that's exactly the experience that I was having in my conversations I was having in my office with members. Was exactly that. It was this clearly suffering personally, expressing issues, frustrated, manifesting it, and not even be able to come to work. And the issue being work, the institution. And these people were already in treatment. And I remember it was a clinician telling me this, it wasn't even that long ago. And somebody approved to take on WSIB patients. And they said to me that they spent the first 10 visits unpacking the institutional betrayal before even getting to their own suffering. And it was this frustration that they had never been able to speak about it because they were saying, okay, well, here's a pill, you got depression, take some time off work and you'll be fine. And obviously there's plenty of clinicians who do great work, and I'm not dismissing that. But they were back in the cycle. Nothing had worked. And this was the whole experiences that I was receiving in the office, that when I was meeting with people, I'm like, they're caught in this loop where there is no progress. And when I heard about the concept of moral injury and the treatment process, that is, again, that epiphany moment where nobody was unpacking any of to get to the root issues. They weren't even discussing the institutional betrayal. It was, I'm going to try to make everybody laugh here, please. I know this is not a funny moment, but tell me about your childhood. Tell me about why you're drinking. Like, not talking about the issues in front of them that have put them into this place. Not acknowledging that there's a distinction between, again, moral injury can't happen in a vacuum. Something has occurred. So they didn't want to talk about what's within their orbit that may have caused it. So that's now, obviously, as you say, this is very complex, and that's a lot of the members I was dealing with that scenario.
Yeah, but as you were talking, as I started to think about this, the other most powerful part of that process is that you're in a group of community of others who've had the same experience. So all of a sudden now you're sitting with a bunch of other cops that have been screwed by the man, and you can talk about that in a way where they get it, where you don't have to try to explain it to another therapist or somebody else. They just automatically get it, right? And so then that allows me to step into that, because that's automatically a validation that you're not alone. This happens to people, and it happens to a lot of people, and it happens to a lot of people, not just in this police force or this profession, or, it's part of, just trying to be a person of service working in institutions. I spent 20 years in the VA trying to do this work, and let me just tell you, working in the VA bureaucracy was a bitch. So, that's where I think a lot of the struggles come. But having other people that have experienced that can allow you to go, take a breath and go, okay, I'm not alone in this. Other people are struggling, and then here's our path forward. It's community, right? It's about connecting with people who get it. And you guys then take the power back from those monstrous people and those monstrous institutions, kind of one group at a time, one process at a time. Yes.
Question for Dr. Keenan. How about with someone who has been so profoundly betrayed that they can't trust anyone, and the idea of sitting in a group with other people is horrifying to them?
Well, every single first responder or veteran that I suggest a group to goes, hell no. I'm not going there. There's no way I'm going to sit with a bunch of people and talk about my deepest, darkest secrets that I don't know. And again, they think it's going to be a bunch of civilian people, a bunch of people who don't know. So there is some important part of putting them into a group with people with similar experiences, although I will say I have had very good success with a lot of very diverse kinds of trauma in these groups, because moral injury connects them all, okay? So they don't have to all be, trigger pullers, whatever. And I think a lot of times people always say, I think too with first responders, it's always, the people in the front lines that got the guns and are getting shot at. Well, we saw not only medical stuff, but we see people in dispatch and all those kinds of places. Can you imagine dispatch where you're sitting on the other end and you have no control? You can't shoot at anybody. You just got to sit there and listen, right? So I think there's some biases around how people always want to separate people. But probably the main way that I get them to give it a try is I'll say that's where the education part comes in, okay? That's really helpful, because I say you don't have to come in and say anything, right? It's going to be mostly educational. Some people will talk if they want to. Would you give it just a try like 3 times? And if it doesn't work, we'll do something different. Well, guess what happens in 3 times? They go, holy crap, that guy's saying exactly what I'm thinking in my head. How do they know that about me? Or I had one guy tell me, he goes, have you been following me around? How do you know this, right? So pretty soon, it's, they start to realize that this is, I am these people and they are me. So yeah, but you gotta twist arms, you gotta dance around, you gotta cajole, you gotta joke, you gotta, lead them down the garden path sometimes. But yeah, it's about just being able to get. My job is just get them with the other people, really.
How many? You said stage 1. How long is that individual stage 1?
No, it's group. 3 months, and like I said, that's the education piece. So it's less threatening, right? You don't have to say a thing. You can sit there and not say anything. And just 3 times. Come 3. And if you say, no, it's not for me, then we'll do something else.
I had that exact same issue when it was introduced to me. And again, not clinical, but my believing I had a decent rapport with the thumb, the pulse of the organization. My first thought was trying to put people who I believe would benefit tremendously, and understanding, I think, having friendships with a lot of these people too. The idea of how they're going to react to group, how they're going to react in a room with other people, especially if they see somebody in there that they think is one of the antagonists in their issue. So obviously there's vetting that occurs, and it's not, like you said, the like-minded or potentially having similar experiences, and the slow introduction into it, not just jumping right into it, where you have to, that nightmare scenario of adult learning where you have to say 3 interesting things about yourself as they go around with the...
We're sitting around holding hands.
Yeah, yeah, exactly, yeah. Yeah.
You know, so, yeah.
I think this is a great opportunity to look at this globally, because this issue goes beyond the city or the province. Most people who have registered for this event are viewing it, through live stream. And so I would like, if possible, for all of you to take turn to just reflect on the next steps. And we will go beyond the city or the province and look at this really of how we can look at moral injury and start the conversation, because we do have vast majority of people watching this that are not even in this room. So any last thoughts before we wrap for the day on how to start this process of conversation about moral injury beyond just the city?
Well, I think that I've been doing this for a long time, and obviously I started off in the veteran space, and it's pretty obvious moral injury when you see it in the veteran space. But and same with first responders. For a while, people are pushing back. Well, how can this fit with first responder? Well, how can this fit with? And as you start to really understand what moral injury is, and you take a panoramic view of what we're dealing with, and what we're dealing with in the world it's man and women's injustice to man and women, right? It's human suffering. And so all of these things are, applicable in terms of, the wars that we have going, how we treat people, in our countries with the politics, all these kinds of things, immigration, homelessness, all the kinds of things that ail society are probably a big part of this. And unless we really start looking at not only the people that are the disenfranchised that have moral injury, but also the people that are trying to help the disenfranchised, right? You don't think therapists get morally injured, right? Right? You're trying to stem the tide of evil, and so of course you're going to pay a price. Bottom line, nobody gets out unscathed if you step into that realm. But I think if we can shift the view of it as being a weakness or a disorder, and know that this is coming, and we have ways to address it, that's going to go a long way to start. But I think just right now, we're just going to have to be starting to talk about this as a consequence of being a person of service that just comes along with the job, right? Just like wearing a uniform, of any kind, whatever the uniform is, right? You're putting on a role, whatever that is. Okay, Ches, you're for us.
I doubt I'll solve it, but I will say this much. There has to be almost immediately a network of professionals out there who could start to see people. This becomes very, very important. This moral injury piece, there's a big difference now between what we normally get when we look at first responders in terms of PTSD and this and that. But the moral injury piece is treated differently clinically. And unfortunately also treated vastly differently within people's organizations. There's a lot more shame and stigma attached to it, unfortunately. So there has to be a certain amount of aggression out there, and again, an available professional network, even if it is very, very small. You have to learn to ask with insistence. You have a good idea of what's wrong with you, but you really don't know how to fix it. The idea that you can go out there and self-heal is ridiculous. You do need the clinical attention to get that underway. That's absolutely important. But right now, my feeling is that the clinical network is kind of small, but there's still one that does exist, and you have to learn to tap into it. Organizations have to be much more open-minded in terms of this particular condition, and we have to get on with dealing with it, because again, if you let this sort of thing go, I mean, at my age now, I'm fairly well into my 60s, it's not just going to be psychological consequences. There will be physical consequences that are very difficult to identify, never mind resolve. So it's not a question of hanging around and waiting for the solution to be delivered. The stakes are very high here, trust me. And so a certain amount of proaction is absolutely necessary to get this underway. But again, there is a small network out there. I mean, I don't want to be presumptuous, but I'm just assuming there is. It has to be tapped in very short order to get people into the clinical stream, to get people well. It is really that simple, in my humble view. Matt?
Interesting. That's how Ches and I met. I was promoting to the RCMP at the time the concepts around fatigue management and moral injury. Unless there is an outright no from management or the institutions, your biggest hurdle introducing this or moving this forward is going to be apathy. If you're, in order to move the dialogue around moral injury, these formats, they're fantastic. Education's important. Willingness to discuss is important. But if you are hoping that the institution or the organization itself, and this doesn't have to even be from a malicious perspective, or I just don't, I refuse to acknowledge it, trying to have people within public service or of service talk about their own issues or even acknowledge that there is a problem within the organization, you have to get through that barrier first. So you have to be aware. It's basically managing an expectation. You're just creating an environment that is conducive to talking, comfortable to talk. That's your first hurdle. And then moving it and navigating it within your organization, it is critical to have the support, obviously, of the organization, but don't expect them to be the leader of it. There's so few people who want to be engaged in this topic. And this is not an indictment on the audience here at all. So congratulations, or the lack thereof of audience. Like, this place could be easily triple of volume here, and it would still not be anywhere near the amount of people who are genuinely interested in this conversation. They're afraid to show up. They're tired. They're mismanaging their own health environment. They just don't have the energy to do it. So it is, there are several hurdles, obviously all available. There's always possibilities, is what I'm trying to say. And if you are interested in this type of programming for what we've created, what I created in Ottawa, Ottawa Police specifically, I believe our New York NYPD, there's some cousins, colleagues out there watching or will be watching tomorrow. This is all available. This was not, obviously there's going to be some proprietary issues with how to navigate a questionnaire that can diagnose, but I'm sure that's something that somebody with inertia and initiative can overcome. We'd be able to manage that. We're available to provide and assist, and through the website there, we're hoping that if you are interested, we are available to help provide the resources, or at least let me rephrase that, not provide the resources, provide the pathway for you to introduce yourself into your organizations.
Yeah, I think for me, the concept of moral injury, I'm definitely going to integrate into my practice for my clients and in the lectures and presentations I do when I travel. But I think for the organizational level, if we're talking about the sanctuary trauma, I created this one art piece that got me into a lot of trouble, but it was authentic. It was around the concept of being targeted for elimination, sanctuary trauma, and it was this firefighter who is sitting on the ground. He's cross-legged. He has a candle, and the candle says PTS, so post-traumatic stress. It's this flame. He's guarding this flame. And his officer with a white hat is pouring gasoline on him. However, the officer is blindfolded, meaning that he doesn't really know the damage that he's causing. And again, I'm very lucky that I get to travel and I speak to a lot of union representation, and a lot of officers, a lot of chiefs, and I've never met a chief that told me that mental health wasn't a priority for them. And most of the time, I believe it. So I think if there's an educational component to it, of if we can show these organizations the benefit of implementing a psychologically healthy workplace, the concept of moral injury, and how effective it can be, also to show them the detrimental effects that can happen without taking advantage of the education of what can happen as far as staff turnover, retraining staff, sexual harassment, lots of different negative concepts, or a lot of negative things that can happen to organizations without being educated on how to take better care of your staff, and to be aware of when that person comes back from that call, to be maybe a little bit more cognizant of the potential secondary trauma or that infliction of moral injury by maybe ripping into them because they're 2 seconds later in their shoot time right after they were dealing with a drowning baby or something. So educating organizations, I think, could be a really beneficial component in addition to educating and being more aware individually of the concept of moral injury.
I just want to thank you, Dr. Keenan, for your point you said about moral injury being an attachment, a person-to-person thing. I think that's really important to underscore and remember. I think I'm going to remember that going forth in my clinical work, so thank you.
Okay, I would like to ask if there are any other questions or comments in the audience. No? And I would like to thank our guests for gifting their time to make this possible today. And our volunteers, particularly and especially Mark Scribner. Mark Scribner, I'm not sure if you're still here. Thank you very much. And our sponsors, there is much more conversation to be had. We have questions we didn't get to, and that is a wonderful thing. I would like to encourage all of us to check our webpage tomorrow for more of a conversation and for anything we will be doing in the future to encourage this conversation and to start taking actual steps to move forward. Thank you very much.
Here is a first responder, probably all of you are in some way. So I want to thank you for your service and know that we see you. We see you, I see you, and there's help, okay? Of course. Yes, Eva, our anchor, always.